I'm always so thrilled when I get the opportunity to come and give a lecture. In my work, in my day job these days, I run School for International Training up the road, our local university, and so they don't let me speak too often, except at like formal events. So thank you to Tundi for allowing me to come and philosophize occasionally with you. This lecture really started from some questions that have been bothering me over the past 4 years since we started this journey with the ring cycle. And that is, I guess I can encapsulate it as, why was the Volsung story so important to the Northern European? Why do we keep coming back to see and hear the ring cycle? And I bet many of you in the room, who is this not their first ring cycle? There we go. That's what I figured, because you keep coming back. And I've been puzzled by the story as well, because it looks like a tragedy to me in so many ways, as somebody who is both a literature person and a philosophy person, and yet it's epic. So how can it be a tragedy? That doesn't make any sense to me. So is it epic that's in a specific form of tragedy? Or on the other hand, if it's a tragedy, why doesn't it fit into tragedy as I know it? That is Greek-style tragedy. So, I mean, when we look at the ring cycle, clearly things don't go too well for most of the humans. Let's just put it out there. Every time we get actually attached to a human, they come to a bad end. You know, you think, oh, Sigmund, here he is, the hero, he dies. Sieglinde, she finally finds love and emancipation, she dies. Siegfried meets Brunhilde, he dies, etc. There doesn't seem to be any sense here of justice or morality, what we would normally associate with Greek tragedy, unless we're simply looking and judging things to be awful, but what can you do about it? And there is no hero who sticks around long enough to be really heroic. Siegfried kills the dragon, but the focus of the ring is really not on him killing the dragon, but on the love story that begins awry and stays awry, until potentially corrected by death, which is hardly an optimistic view of the world. What is the morality, or failing that, what is the fate structure of the ring cycle? And this is something I keep coming back to. Perhaps love, and actually Hugh hinted at this when he introduced us to the ring cycle at the beginning of Das Rheingold a few days ago, that because all those who love die, so therefore it must be love as a force, or are we redeeming the world through love? Is there anything that saves us here? Maybe, as in Greek tragedy, this is more about what the audience feels rather than the inner workings of the drama. What is different then would be in the ring, it's so much more about then it would have to be what the audience feels rather than what is actually happening in the world of the ring cycle. So I began this journey of lectures on the ring cycle 4 years ago, discussing the relationship between this theatre and the temples of Greece, e.g., for instance, the Parthenon. And those of you who have been able to see in Britain the Elgin marbles, otherwise known as the Parthenon marbles, I would like to apologize on behalf of my country. So you will have noticed that there was on one side of the Parthenon a series of centaurs, and then on the other side, gods. And this is really something that you constantly see in Greek temples, this distinction between centaurs or the world of the senses or the world of nature, wild man, you know, with sexual desires and sensual desires. And then on the other side, the order of the universe of the gods. And in particular, you will see this very much at Delphi. But with Delphi, it's a little different, those of you who may have been or can see it online, because it's not centaurs per se, it's Dionysius, who's on one side, and Apollo on the other. And in the middle, between the two, is the omphalos, also known as the navel of the world, where the priestess used to prophesy for the oracle. So ironically, we think of Delphi as being the shining example of the rule of Apollo. But in fact, it's about this, shall we say, this opposition which is held in tension through the nature of the temple itself between this god Dionysius and this god Apollo. So who is Dionysius? Well, Dionysius is a very easy answer in some respects. Dionysius is the Greek god of wine and having a good time and getting drunk and going out there and losing it. There's a certain idea of Dionysiac frenzy or Dionysiac madness. So, for instance, those of you who've read the Bacchae, the Greek tragedy, Bacchus and Dionysius are very interlinked. So women go out there, they drink too much, they get intoxicated, and they tear apart whatever they come across, including a man in one case. But Dionysius is far more complicated than that, and he's actually related to the mystery cycles of Greece. Dionysius supposedly was born from Demeter and was born to be the savior of the world. And the Titans, because there was jealousy, because Dionysius was therefore the, shall we say, the favored of God. So the Titans were encouraged to go and kill Dionysius. So Dionysius was taken, kidnapped, taken down into the underworld, which, by the way, whenever you see that sort of story in a Greek myth, it means it's connected to the mysteries, and was torn apart, limb from limb, into many pieces. So he is the god who was one, who becomes many. But then Dionysius, because Demeter was so mourning the loss of her son, and so was Zeus mourning the loss of his son too, that it was permitted that Dionysius could be put back together again and was reborn through Demeter. So there's something really, really interesting there, because it's the idea of the individual who becomes many, who becomes one again. So this is what is being discussed at Delphi. And you may think, okay, where she's going with this? Actually, directly to Nietzsche. This is the background you need. So as you'll see around here, we have Apollo. He's up there with his chariot and a lyre, thereby associated with music. But Dionysius is missing. So here, in this world of the Lactus Fieta, there is no savage world. There is no world of nature, the world of the senses, the world of getting drunk and going crazy and ripping people up, or world of the mysteries. There is no world of Dionysius, which takes me directly to Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music, which offers a connection between the German and the Greek, and potentially some ways to figure out some of the questions I had, and to harmonize once again the world of Apollo here in this Fieta with what's actually happening on this stage over the past week. Fortuitously, Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy is also a series of lectures that he turned into a book at the suggestion of Richard Wagner and his sister. The book is intimately connected to the ring cycle, as we shall see. Just for once, as a philosopher, I am happy that I can take a theoretical position that also happens to coincide with the author's intention. I have to tell you, that makes me feel very uncomfortable, because I'm normally used to arguing against intention. In Nietzsche's preface that was written later, when he's looking back on this piece, he tells us the question with which he began, the Greeks. He says, "They are the most accomplished, most beautiful, most universally envied race of mankind, those most capable of seducing us into life. But they were the ones who seeded tragedy." So let's take a quick look at what he's really talking about. He's actually referring to that moment of Greek tragedy around Aeschylus and Sophocles. He's pretty picky, is Nietzsche. He kind of likes Greek tragedy up to a certain point. He doesn't like Euripides. He says that's not tragedy. He likes some of Sophocles, but he really loves Aeschylus. He's really talking about Orestes and the Agamemnon. He's talking about Prometheus in particular, which we'll come back to. He's talking about Oedipus. And he's also referring us back to that great theory of tragedy, Aristotle's theory of tragedy, which is about the impact of the tragic moment on the audience, to go back to that sense of what are we supposed to be feeling here, and is that the point of the ring cycle? And Aristotle, as you probably know, he says that through pity and fear, we arrive at catharsis, or a cleansing of our emotions. So we come and watch tragedy to have our emotions cleansed and to feel part of a community again. Now, there wasn't a lot of discussion about tragedy between Aristotle and Nietzsche's day, but there was a lot of rediscussions coming up in the 19th century on the nature of tragedy. Nietzsche in particular was interested in Schopenhauer's ideas. What he discusses in the second part of his book, World as Will and Representation, what gives everything tragic, whatever the form in which it appears, its characteristic tendency to the sublime, is the dawning of the knowledge that the world and life can give no true satisfaction, and are therefore not worth our attachment to them. It is in this that the tragic spirit consists. Accordingly, it leads to resignation. So this is a new theory of tragedy that Nietzsche is working with here, and profoundly disagrees with. And I think we have to very much connect this to the ring cycle. What you are supposed to experience at the end of the ring cycle is not necessarily catharsis, a cleansing of your emotions, and it's certainly not resignation. Nietzsche says what Schopenhauer is missing is Dionysius. So if not resignation, then what? Do we learn something, perhaps, in tragedy? And this takes me back to my concerns that I can't find any justice here in the ring cycle. I can't find the morality of the piece. Nietzsche commented later on his work that he seeks a philosophy that dares to demote morality and locate it in the phenomenal world, the world of phenomena. And not only among the phenomena, in the technical sense of the term as used by the idealists, but among the deceptions as illusion, delusion, error, interpretation, artifice, art. Morality itself, might morality not be a will to the denial of life, a secret instinct of annihilation, a principle of decay, trivialization, slander, the beginning of the end, and hence the danger to end all dangers. So then, with this questionable book, my instinct, an affirmative instinct for life, Nietzsche says, turned against morality and invented a fundamentally opposite doctrine and valuation of life, purely artistic. What should I call it? Who knows the true name? With the name of a Greek god, I call it the Dionysiac. So anything that is in part Dionysian, Nietzsche argues, morality is out the window. That is not what Greek tragedy is about, he says, and that therefore explains potentially why, when we look at the ring cycle, that morality is actually not at the forefront. And we'll come back to that right at the end. So tragedy is therefore a denial of the moral code of justice, to be replaced by something he calls Dionysian. Is this therefore the triumph of Dionysius over Apollo, over the ruler of forms, as the figure of order in the universe? We get rid of order in favor of being, or perhaps becoming, or what? Actually, what Nietzsche is arguing is, just like the temple at Delphi, tragedy is a combination of the Apollonian and the Dionysian. So let's go back to who these folks are. To the two gods of art, Nietzsche says, Apollo and Dionysius, we owe our recognition that in the Greek world there is a tremendous opposition as regards both origins and aims between the Apolline art of the sculptor and the non-visual Dionysiac art of music. These two very different tendencies walk side by side, usually in violent opposition to one another, inciting one another to ever more powerful births, perpetuating the struggle of the opposition, only apparently bridged by the word art, until finally, by a metaphysical miracle of the Hellenic will, the two seem to be coupled. And in this coupling, they seem at last to beget the word work of art that is as Dionysiac as it is Apolline, and that is Attic tragedy, Greek tragedy. Obviously, Nietzsche is taking our understanding of Dionysius and Apollo in multiple directions, not necessarily invalid from their origins. For example, he relates Apollo to dreams, just as Delphi, and Dionysius to intoxication, Delphi and the Bacchic, but also potentially the Eleusinian mysteries, where Greeks would drink as something that probably contained something interesting, and had a ritualistic experience that was both a physical journey but also a mental trip. But then asserts that these two are also separate in their artistic forms. So Apollo looks after the plastic arts. Those are the sculpture, architect, etc. Dionysius over music. But of course, it's more complicated than this, because after all, Apollo may be the god of this building, and we look around, and this is a neoclassical building, and that's perfectly correct in Nietzsche's world. This is Doric architecture. But he also holds his lyre, so there is a musical involvement. So let's look a little bit closer at Apollo. In dreams that the great sculptor first saw, the delightful bodies of superhuman beings, and the Hellenic poet, if question about the mysteries of poetic creation, would also have referred to dreams. That is the eidolon. I'm not going to go into the eidolon because that would take me in an area that really is another lecture. But it's very cool if anybody wants to check it out. But our image of Apollo must incorporate the delicate line that the dream image may not overstep without becoming pathological, in which case illusion would deceive us as solid reality. So Apollo offers us illusion and deception as art, just as you can see up there, we have the front of a Greek temple, but it is obviously not the front of a Greek temple. It is illusion. Through form. And that's how art is partially created. It needs that restraining boundary, the form, that freedom from wilder impulses, that sagacious calm of the sculptor god. His eye must be sun-like as befits his origin. Even should it rage and show displeasure, it still bears the solemnity of the beautiful illusion. Apollo also represents the individual, which is, at its most archetypal, the hero. We might even describe, Nietzsche suggests, Apollo as the glorious divine image of what he calls the principium individuationis, that is, the principle of individuality, from whose gestures and looks all the delight, wisdom, and beauty of illusion speak to us. And here, suddenly I feel on firmer ground. I can think Sigmund, I can think Siegfried in particular. This is an Apolline figure. Apollo, though, is also civilization, order, form, beauty, especially in terms of proportion. Whereas both of our heroes in the ring cycle actually come out of nature and the savage. They are related to the wolf. They are Volsungs. They wear the wolf. All the heroes in this piece are not Apolline heroes, even though they represent the principle of individuality. They kind of do both, and they require both. If it can be seen as at all imperative and prescriptive, Nietzsche says, this deification of individuation knows but a single law, the individual. That is the maintenance of the boundaries of the individual, and that is through moderation. And I think we can say very, very clearly that the Volsungs, they're not about moderation. Apollo is also morality, in the sense that everyone gets their just deserts. Apollo, as an ethical deity, demands moderation from his followers, and in order to maintain it, self-knowledge. So self-knowledge is also really crucial. And ironically, Siegfried's downfall in many respects is, and Brunhilde, it's all around deception and illusion. People don't even know who they are or cannot recognize each other. So here's where Dionysius steps forward. Dionysius provides us with the opposite, the fragmentation or tearing apart of that principle of individuation, and then the coming back together again into a oneness where Dionysius, the divided dead god, is reborn. So in Nietzsche's golden age of Greek tragedy, it was for his titanic love of man that Prometheus had to be torn apart by vultures, for his excessive wisdom in solving the riddle of the Sphinx that Oedipus had to be cast out. Thus did the Delphic god interpret the Greek past. Dionysius, Nietzsche says, is intoxication is the blissful ecstasy which, prompted by the same fragmentation of the principle of individuation, rises up from men's innermost core, indeed from nature. We are vouchsafed a glimpse into the nature of the Dionysiac, most immediately understandable to us in the analogy of being drunk. So Dionysius is the nature, world, the satire. So Dionysiac music relates obviously to civilization, but Wagner says that, how do I put this, that Dionysiac music is like daytime. And so if you try and put Apolline form into daylight as a lamp, then you will not see Apolline form. It is always about the primal. In the same way, I believe, Nietzsche says, the Greek man of culture felt himself annulled in the face of the satire chorus. And the immediate effect of Dionysiac tragedy is that state and society, the gulf separating man from man, make way for an overwhelming sense of unity that goes back to the very heart of nature. The metaphysical consolation with which, as I wish to point out, every true tragedy leaves us, that whatever superficial changes may occur, life is at bottom indestructibly powerful and joyful, is given, therefore, concrete form in what we see on stage. Through the chorus of natural beings living ineradicably behind all civilization, as it were, remaining the same forever regardless of the changing generations and the paths of history, just as the Volsung saga remains always at the heart of Germanic myth. Not only is the bond between man and man sealed by the Dionysiac magic, alienated, hostile, or subjugated nature too celebrates her reconciliation with her lost son, man. The earth gladly offers up her gifts, and the ferocious creatures of the cliffs and the desert peacefully draw near. The chariot of Dionysius is piled high with flowers and garlands. Under its yoke stride tigers and panthers. If we were to turn, Nietzsche says, Beethoven's Hymn of Joy into a painting and not to restrain the imagination, even as the multitudes bowed awestruck into the dust, this would bring us close to the Dionysiac. Now the slave is a free man. Now all the rigid and hostile boundaries that distress, despotism, or impudent fashion have erected between man and man break down. Now, with the gospel of world harmony, each man feels himself not only united, reconciled, and at one with his neighbor, but see with him as if the veil of Maya had been rent and now hung in rags before the mysterious primal oneness. Man is no longer an artist, he has become a work of art. The artistic power of the whole of nature reveals itself to the supreme gratification of the primal oneness amidst the paroxysms of intoxication. So, is that what we experience when we see the ring cycle? Dionysiac art wishes to convince us of the eternal delight of existence, but we are to seek that delight not in phenomena, but behind phenomena. It wishes us to acknowledge that everything that comes into being must be prepared to face a sorrowful end. It forces us to look at the terrors of individual existence, yet we are not to be petrified with fear. This is very un-Aristotelian. A metaphysical consolation rests us momentarily from the bustle of changing forms. For a brief moment, we really become the primal essence itself and feel its unbounded lust for existence, of delight in existence. Now we see the struggles, the torment, the destruction of phenomena as necessary, given the constant proliferation of forms of existence, forcing and pushing their way into life, the exuberant fertility of the world will. We are pierced by the raging goad of those torments, just as we become one with the vast primal delight in existence and sense the eternity of that delight in Dionysiac ecstasy. For all our pity and terror, we are happy to be alive, not as individuals, but as the single living thing merged with its creative delight. So it's us who are torn apart and become one again through a primal rebirth through this experience. So it sounds to me like Dionysius is just one, so I'm not quite sure about this opposition. But Nietzsche says you do need both. For me, Nietzsche says, Apollo and Dionysius are the vivid and concrete representations of two worlds of art, utterly different in their deepest essence and their highest aims. Apollo I see as the transfiguring genius of the principle of the individual, the sole path to true redemption through illusion. While in the mystical, triumphal cry of Dionysius, the spell of individuation is broken and the path is open to the mothers of being, to the innermost core of things. This is a tremendous opposition, Nietzsche says, this yawning abyss between the Apolline plastic arts and Dionysiac music. But here in the high artistic symbolism, we behold that Apolline world of beauty in its substratum, the terrible wisdom of Dionysius, the whisper that King Midas hears. What is best of all is utterly beyond your reach. Not to be born, not to be nothing. But the second best for you is to die soon. And we therefore intuitively understand that both are necessary. Apollo is the apotheosis of the principle of the individual. Only through him does the perpetually attained goal of primal oneness, redemption through illusion, reach consummation. With sublime gestures, he reveals to us how the whole world of torment is necessary so that the individual can create the redeeming vision and then, immersed in contemplation of it, sit peacefully in its tossing boat amid the waves. But with Dionysius, you are never going to be left to sit peacefully. The Apolline Greeks also saw the effect of this as titanic and barbaric. Behold, Apollo could not live without Dionysius. And that is what we see on this stage. We see Siegfried, the hero, the apotheosis of the principle of individuation. We see Brunhilde, the heroine. We see Sigmund, the hero, who all striving to be free and yet contained. But at the same time, we also have the music and we have the death. We have the understanding that sometimes it is better not to be born, it is better not to be. Here in this supreme menace to the will, there approaches a redeeming, healing enchantress, art, and that's where we come to Apollo. She alone can turn these thoughts of repulsion at the horror and absurdity of existence into ideas compatible with life. These are the sublime, the taming of horror through art. The Hellene is saved by the coming together of the two forces. After the tenderest and deepest suffering, when their piercing gaze is seen to the core of the terrible destructions of world history and nature's cruelty, when you have truly understood that it is sometimes better not to be, when they run the risk of Schopenhauerian denial of the will or resignation, the Hellene, Nietzsche says, is saved by art. And through art, life has saved him for itself. This is epitomized in the Prometheus myth. So Apollo seeks to pacify individuals by drawing boundaries between them and by repeatedly calling them to mind as the most sacred universal laws in his demands for self-knowledge and moderation. And then there is the Dionysiac. In Prometheus's case, his brother Atlas, who takes the world on his back, this titanic impulse to become the Atlas of all individuals and on one's broad back to bear them ever higher, ever further, is the bond that unites the Promethean and the Dionysiac. In this respect, the Aeschylean Prometheus is a Dionysiac mask, while in the profound longing for justice, Aeschylus reveals his paternal descent from Apollo, the god of individuation and of just boundaries, the god of understanding. And the two-faced nature of the Aeschylean Prometheus, at once Apollonian and Promethean, might be expressed in this conceptual formula. All that exists is just and unjust, and equally justified in both. In these ideas, we already have all the component parts of a profound and pessimistic view of the world, and at the same time, the mystery doctrine of tragedy, the basic understanding of the unity of all things. Individuation is seen as the primal source of evil, art as the joyful hope that the spell of individuation can be broken as a presentiment of a restored oneness. Apollo and Dionysius in tension. So where does music really come in? And let's see if we can move this rapidly back to what Wagner was thinking about and what Nietzsche thinks Wagner is thinking about. So if this is a classical tragedy, the ring cycle, then what now? Nietzsche is, after all, making an analogy between the Greeks and the Germans of the 19th century. He is discussing in actuality not the birth of tragedy, but the rebirth of tragedy out of the spirit of music. So let's return to the question of the Apollonian and Dionysian in music. The sculptor, like his close kin, the epic poet, has lost himself in pure contemplation of images, Nietzsche argues. Without a single image, the Dionysiac musician is himself nothing but primal suffering and its primal resonance. So music without image is just primal suffering. Image without music is simply we're just lost in contemplation and we're in a dream. For the world, symbolism of music cannot be exhaustively interpreted through language because it symbolically refers to the primal contradiction and the primal suffering within the primal oneness, and thus symbolizes a sphere beyond and prior to all phenomena. So you need something that is beyond language, but you also need language and images. In comparison with this, all phenomena are mere symbols. Hence, language as the organ and symbol of phenomena can never uncover the innermost core of music, but once it attempts to imitate music, always remains in superficial contact with it, and no amount of lyrical eloquence can bring its deepest meaning a step closer. Indeed, he argues backward into time. He asks, what was this force that freed Prometheus from his vultures and made myth the vehicle of Dionysiac wisdom? It was the Herculean force of music, which supremely manifested in tragedy, was able to interpret myth with new and most profound eloquence. This, as we have already shown, is music's most powerful capacity. So we go beyond language to myth, and we have music that marries with it. Music reifies or makes substantial the phenomena, the primal, And so we can consider the phenomenal world of nature and music as two different expressions of the same thing. And that really relates well to the ring cycle, because all of our heroes are from nature. They are from the phenomenal. Urda sits at the heart of everything. Now, if we return to Schopenhauer for a minute, music, Schopenhauer says, is the immediate language of the will, with our imagination impelled to give form to the spirit world that speaks to us, invisible and yet vitally stirring, and embody it as an analogous example. But Nietzsche says, on the other hand, image and concept, influenced by a truly corresponding music, attain a higher level of significance. Thus, Dionysiac art tends to exert two kinds of influence on the Apolline artistic faculty. Music encourages a symbolic intuition of Dionysiac universality, and then endows that symbolic image with the highest level of significance. From these facts, quite intelligible in themselves and not inaccessible to deeper consideration, we can conclude that music can give birth to the myth, the most significant of examples, and the tragic myth above all, the myth that speaks symbolically of the Dionysiac wisdom, layers upon layers of this opposition between the Dionysian and the Apolline. The tragic cannot be honestly inferred from the nature of art as it is conventionally conceived. Only from the spirit of music, Nietzsche argues, can we understand delight in the destruction of the individual. For only in single instances of such destruction can we clearly see the eternal phenomenon of Dionysiac art, which expresses the will in its omnipotence, behind the principium individuationis, behind the principle of the individual, the eternal life that lies beyond the phenomenal world. We are seeing a vision of eternity, of the primal, of the before of the ordered universe, when we look at tragedy in this particular form of music, this marriage of myth and music. Metaphysical delight in the tragic is a translation of the image. The hero, the supreme manifestation of the will, is negated for our gratification because he is only a phenomenon, and the eternal life of the will is left untouched by his destruction. We believe in eternal life is tragedy's cry, while music is the immediate idea of that life. The purpose of the plastic arts is quite different. Here Apollo overcomes the suffering of the individual by means of the luminescent glorification of the eternity of the phenomenon. Beauty triumphs over the suffering inherent in life. Pain is in a certain sense deluded away from amongst the features of nature. In Dionysiac art and its tragic symbolism, the same nature addresses us with its true, undisguised voice. Be like me, the primal mother, eternally creative, eternally impelling into life, eternally drawing satisfaction from the ceaseless flux of phenomena. Okay, we're getting closer. So we have these two things in opposition. We understand now that there is a certain form here of music that seems to be this Dionysian music. We understand there is a certain type of story or of form that is Apolline that need to come together. And then there are layers, of course, within that. And we are talking, therefore, about a new form of tragedy that marries tragedy with myth and with music. Okay, so are we talking about opera? Actually, no, we are not. Sorry, that sounds like a bit of a letdown, doesn't it? But wait, there's more. Opera, Nietzsche's not a fan. He says it's the offspring of the theoretical man, the critical layman, not the artist. It is based on a fallacious belief concerning the artistic process, the idyllic belief that anyone capable of emotion is an artist. According to this belief, opera is the expression of amateurism in art. dictating its laws with the cheerful optimism of theoretical man, i.e. the person who does not do. In opera, art is responding to a powerful need, but that need is not aesthetic. Ouch. The longing for an idyll, a belief in the primordial existence of the artistic good man. Opera was seen as the rediscovered country of that idyllically or heroically good creature who obeyed a natural artistic impulse in all that he did, and every time he had something to say, sang it, at least in part, bursting fully into song at the slightest stirring of the emotions. And I have to tell you, those who know me will know that after a couple of glasses of wine, and therefore a little bit of Dionysiac intoxication, this is exactly what I have to say about musicals. It's like a good play spoiled because they suddenly burst into song for no reason whatsoever. So the face of opera is not marked by the elegiac pain of eternal loss, but rather by the cheerfulness of eternal rediscovery, the cozy enjoyment of an idyllic reality, which can at least be imagined as real at any time, perhaps at the same time with a sense that this supposed reality is nothing but a fantastically silly dalliance, which would make anyone capable of comparing it with the terrible seriousness of nature as it really is, or with the primal scenes of mankind's actual origins, cry in disgust, "Away with you, this phantom." So in opera, magic is utterly estranged from its true dignity as Dionysiac mirror to the world, to the point where it is a slave to appearance. It can only imitate the form of the phenomenal world of nature, and from the play of lines and proportions produce just simply a superficial amusement. So close observation reveals that this fatal influence of opera on music practically coincides, Nietzsche argues, with the whole of the development of modern music. Ouch. The optimism that lurks in the genesis of opera and in the essence of the culture it represents has managed with frightening rapidity to divest music of its Dionysiac cosmic significance and to turn it into a formally playful entertainment. So this is where we again might pause and think, yeah, that doesn't sound like the ring cycle. I have to say that, the idea of shepherds happily bursting into song to express what a great day it is not what I think of when I think of the ring cycle. So, funnily enough, for Nietzsche, Wagner is different. He says, "What hopes must awake in us when all the most certain signs augur the opposite process, the gradual awakening of the Dionysiac spirit in our contemporary world. From the Dionysiac soil of the German spirit, a power has arisen that has nothing in common with the original conditions. That culture can neither explain nor excuse it, but instead finds it terrifying and inexplicable, powerful and hostile, and that is German music." Just German, by the way. Nietzsche wasn't at all prejudiced in any way. So German music, as we know it, preeminently in its mighty sun cycle from Bach to Beethoven, from Beethoven to Wagner. I have to say, I can get really behind him here. What we have here is something that he calls not opera, but musical tragedy, that bringing together of the Dionysiac and the Apollonian. This is the rebirth of Greek tragedy. This is what he is talking about. It is in this form that the tragic myth, that is the plastic world of dreams, and the tragic hero, the principal or heightened individual, are interposed between our highest musical stimulation and the music. They are, he says, at bottom only a symbol of the most universal facts, of which music alone can speak directly. But if we perceived them as purely Dionysiac beings, the myth would lose all of its symbolic power. It would come to an unnoticed standstill beside us, and not for a moment distract us from the reverberations of the primal universe. So the music without Siegfried as the hero The myth disappears. But now Apolline power, aimed at the reconstitution of the almost fragmented individual, emerges with the healing balm of a blissful deception. We imagine, we see, Nietzsche says, Tristan motionlessly, gloomily asking, the old melody, why does it awaken me? How powerfully this pity may affect us. In a sense, it delivers us from the primal sufferings of the world, just as the symbol of the myth preserves us from gazing directly on the supreme idea of the world, just as thoughts and words save us from the umbricked effusion of the unconscious will. Through that glorious Apolline deception, Nietzsche says, it seems as though the realm of sound has assumed the form of a visible world, as though it is here that Tristan's and Isolde's fate has been shaped and molded from the most delicate and expressive material. Thus, the Apolline wrests us from the Dionysiac universality and delights us in these individuals. To them, it attaches our pity. Through them, it satisfies our sense of beauty, which craves great and sublime forms. It parades images of life before us and moves us to a contemplative understanding of the core of life contained within them. With the tremendous impact of image, concept, morality, and sympathetic stirrings, the Apolline lifts man out of his orgiastic self-destruction and deceives him about the universality of the Dionysiac event, deluding him into the idea that he can see only a single image of the world, Tristan and Isolde, and that he will see it better and more profoundly through music. For indeed, Nietzsche is writing at a really important moment. These are the lectures of 1873 to 4. Those of you who know your Wagner, this is just post-Tristan. It is also right in between the writing of Das Rheingold, Die Valkyrie, and then Siegfried and Die Götterdämmerung. Nietzsche tells us that it is indeed Wagner and this new form, the musical tragedy, that brings us back to the real spirit of tragedy. Not the moral, not the cathartic, but a vision of the primal in music, but in form of the illusion of the mythic, the illusion of the great hero. And it is no coincidence that Wagner's next piece was Siegfried. Nietzsche says, there have been signs that the German spirit still rests and dreams undestroyed, in wonderful health and profundity, like a slumbering night in some inaccessible abyss. And from that abyss, the Dionysiac song rises up to us, telling us that the German knight is still dreaming his ancient Dionysiac myth in blissful, serious images. The Volsung cycle, the Volsung saga, still echoes down the years. Let no one imagine that the German spirit has lost its mythical home forever, as long as it still clearly understands the voices of the birds, in reference to the Volsung saga, telling it of that home. One day, Nietzsche says, and it ain't gonna be too far off, in all the morning freshness that follows a tremendous sleep, then that spirit will slay dragons, destroy the wicked dwarfs, and awaken Brunhilde. And Wotan's spear itself will not be able to bar its way. Thank you. Yes.
Let me see if I can say this right. It's difficult to understand why Wagner says Siegfried is the greatest hero. I mean, he slays the dragon, but doesn't really learn anything or help anybody.
Yep.
And just about when he's going to go off and do heroic things, he gets drugged and really fucks up. And when Brunhilde says, make the powerful the greatest hero, and here's why, and that he just did everything with full conviction, the good and the bad. I'm like, okay, maybe that's an insight into what Wagner means, but it's still, it's so hard to understand. So can you explain in the Apollonian versus Dionysian?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's interesting because it's not just Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I've started wandering off, as is my way. So.
Could you encapsulate the question again for everybody?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. So the question is about why does Wagner think that Siegfried is the ultimate hero, right? Yes, I mean, actually, that's where I started this lecture, right? What is it about the Volsung saga, which is the saga of Siegfried, that, like, it's not just Wagner. It's, I mean, you can take it from Icelanders, Norwegians, Germans, Anglo-Saxons. Siegfried and the Volsung saga somehow is like at the center of everything. And I must admit, I find it very difficult to understand, which is, I mean, I'm an Anglo-Saxon, you know, and I am not clear, because you are absolutely correct. Siegfried is really not much of a hero. And it also relates to me, the notion of being hero with the tragic, right? You know, is he a hero because he slays the dragon? Or is he a hero because everything ends, because it's this great love story and everything ends so badly? You know, I mean, it's really unclear to me. But, yes, sorry, go on.
Well, I was going to say, Brunhilde definitely is a hero, and she thinks he's the greatest hero. So.
Yes. And in fact, actually, so the question back was, Brunhilde thinks that Siegfried is the greatest hero. And in fact, actually, if you go and look at the different fragments of the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, that, you know, some of the kind of the key components that Wagner is using here, a lot of them are actually laments from Brunhilde. You know, there's some really beautiful poetry out there about Brunhilde, talking about Siegfried and this deception and everything. So there is a real... Siegfried doesn't have much of a voice in those stories even. It's Brunhilde's voice comes through very strongly. So I do think that it's this concept... I mean, the way he's explaining it, and I do kind of get it, is that this idea of the hero, the Apollonian is the principle of the hero, so Siegfried as hero, but at the same time, it's the hero has to. I don't want to get too far here because this is not necessarily my point of view, but it's this idea that the hero also is the kind of community sacrifice, really, when you think about it. You know, so that the idea is that we see the hero be heroic and then get pulled apart, right? So I think that is also something going on there, but I don't even, that's another lecture on why epic is not tragedy, but also is a different form of tragedy. So, and I don't want to go there with that. So I think that's how Wagner and Nietzsche would explain it. Where I'm at, it's still very much something that I'm playing with.
Don't you think that one way of understanding this conundrum is that at the beginning, when Wagner has the initial conception of this drama, he's going to apotheosize Siegfried, but he shifts his loyalty from Siegfried to Wotan and then to Brunhilde. But we still have remnants of Siegfried as hero, which creates the contradiction. Wagner does not fully eliminate those problems. By the way, on the issue of epic, don't you think that Homer's Iliad is a tragedy? He's showing the tragedy of constant war. As Heraclitus says, war is the father of all things. And the only redeeming feature is Hector, who happens to be a Trojan, and the similes of the pastoral life, which shows us an alternative to the ubiquity of war. This is a tragedy. This is epic as tragedies.
Okay, so two questions. So let me go back to the original. You're talking about the fact that Wagner's opinion I'm just repeating it for the recording, Wagner's opinion of the different characters changes. I don't dispute that, but the problem is that coming at it with an interpretive eye, in a way, you need to start by trying to see it as a whole, right? And make sense of it as a whole.
The Bible can't be seen as a whole. It's got to be seen in layers.
Well, we would agree to disagree on this one. I mean, the thing is, of course, there are layers to it, of course. But you do, when you're attempting to take on a text and to provide an interpretation, you're attempting to see it as if it is potentially a whole.
If it has a history, how can you see it as a whole? In Genesis 1, animals precede human beings.
I'm not going to argue about the Bible as a holistic work of art. I'm going to argue about the ring cycle. So the ring cycle is presented to us as a holistic work of art. And so we have to attempt over this series of a week to make sense of it, right? I am not going to try and make sense of the whole Bible this afternoon. That's definitely another lecture, but it's one I would also enjoy giving. And by the way, I totally get your point about that. But the ring cycle, I mean, however much one may know about revisions, etc., it's like, what are we being presented with here? And what are we experiencing, deriving from that? Now, regarding epic as tragedy is a particular form. So what I would argue is not that the Iliad is not tragic, but that it is a form of tragic art that hasn't been necessarily fully discussed. Because of our notions of classical tragedy, whether they come from the Greeks or whether they come from the 19th century. Oops. Yes?
I spoke earlier this week, and we have very different ways of
looking you're doing love and philosophy.
Yeah, looking at the same sort of dialectic of conscious attempts, phenomenal and noumenal, of course. But I just wanted to say, one of the chapters of my book goes into that process of transforming Siegfried's Tod into the ring cycle, and Wagner does work tremendously hard at establishing a unity. All of the parallels between Schwarz Albrecht and Licht Albrecht, all of that is built in to make sure that this is a single, it is in a way two stories. But the stories echo one another.
More than two stories.
Yes, yeah, but I mean, it starts as an Albrecht story, and the Wotan story sort of arches over it. But yes, the stories all reflect one another, just as different interpretations of the process of the noumenal reflect one another.
So the discussion here is about the ring cycle, how we can see it as a whole, and the question or the comment is that in fact all the layers do reflect each other. I have to say I have a harder time with it. It's something I'm trying to put it into a whole, and I'm playing with different ways of coming at it, but I haven't yet fully argued to myself wholly convincingly how it is a whole.
There are problems. I mean, we always hear the beginning of Reinbold as the beginning of the universe, and yet, of course, Albrecht is a completely self-conscious, painfully self-conscious character, and it's happened in the history that began some time ago when Wotan cut the branch from the world ash tree and set out. So it's not the beginning of the world. And Wagner never does quite settle that out.
So I would also say, though, if we take Nietzsche's perspective here, we're not talking about a chronology, and actually I find that quite useful personally. We're not talking about beginning and ending. We're talking about the primal and the civilized, and the community and the individual. and everything exists at the same time. And something I didn't discuss today, which I could have done, is Nietzsche's notion of eternal return and the joyfulness of eternal return. And, and I think that is very much embedded in the ring cycle. The goal goes back to the Rhine maidens at the end. And so in Nietzschean terms, here we go all over again, right? The cycle then repeats. So I do not see it as a in-time piece necessarily, which I actually find quite helpful, because I do find the in-time piece more complicated. Hang on, I'm going to go over here, and then I'll come back to you, right?
Yeah, can you talk about the nature of community in tragedy? So I'm thinking of something like the Oresteia Aeschylus. There's a very big disruption in the community, and it ends with a new way of the community being.
Right.
And the ring, there's a very big disruption, and then it ends with the passing of the old order into, well, we don't know what exactly, but into some kind of new order, with the humans, ascendant in the world. How does that tie into, or does it tie into, this notion of the Apollonian Dionysian?
So the question is about the notion of community and the way that tragedy does not, and I would agree with you, tragedy doesn't only say, as Aristotle argues, it's not just about the cleansing of the emotions, right? It's about it's the ending of an old order and the beginning of something else. That somehow we come together as a group with some sort of restoration, but a restoration of what? I would agree with that, and I think, what's interesting with Nietzsche's notion of the Apolline is that he's saying that this is done through deception or illusion, right? So we are intoxicated by the music, and we're given a deception or an illusion of the dream, of what's happening on the stage, and through that we are torn apart, and then we're brought back together again. And there is a form of apotheosis, but what is that apotheosis? Maybe it's us, right? So, but what happens next? I'm not, yeah. Maybe Nietzsche would probably say, and then it happens all over again, right? So, and over to you, and then over here.
So speaking of the notion of the eternal return of the same, that could be given two very different interpretations.
Yes.
One is ontological, the other is psychological. The ontological is more problematic, that things themselves. But I think Nietzsche's point, and I think this points to the difference between Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, is that I should will that what I have experienced and done, I would be willing to do all over again in spite of the tragic components. And this is where you get affirmation. For Schopenhauer, the will is destructive, period, and we have to try to bracket it out to do something else. For Nietzsche, the will can be turned to the will for joy. To me, the ring cycle is much more Schopenhauerian in this sense than Nietzschean. Because I think the will is the big problem here.
The thing is, I have to sort of say what you just said. So, okay, let me summarize. You're arguing, and by the way, I would agree, that Nietzsche's birth of tragedy, not Nietzsche, but Nietzsche's birth of tragedy is far more Schopenhauerian than it is later Nietzschean, because it has more of that sense of resignation and the question of the will than that later joy, the will to joy, the will to be. And actually at the beginning of my lecture, I was actually quoting Nietzsche's reflections at the point when he was precisely talking about the will to be, the will to power, all of those different pieces. And he was reflecting back, and in fact, he actually says himself, oh my God, I was very Schopenhauerian at that time. Even though apparently he doesn't seem to agree with Schopenhauer all the way through, which I hopefully noted in my lecture. So it's more Schopenhauerian, but it's not Schopenhauerian, if you see what I'm saying. Is it more ontological? Is it more psychological than ontological? I'm always very uncomfortable with distinguishing between the two, because that's actually metaphysics and ontology is my jam. So I do the deep past. So I do find that divide kind of problematic. But would I say that Nietzsche's notion of eternal return is only about the will to power, or the joy of return, or being willing to affirm and say yes to reliving? I wouldn't say it's only that too. I do think there's an ontological context, personally.
Walter Kaufmann's book on Nietzsche.
Yes, I do. Yeah, it's the first one I read on Nietzsche. Yeah.
That's the word psychologist in the subtitle.
Yes.
He thinks of Nietzsche as a psychologist.
I know, it's a very particular book of its time, if I may say, from that point of view, when psychology ruled supreme. Whereas I think we don't necessarily these days, there was a moment when the answer to everything was psychology, which is perfectly fine, and it definitely has its place. But I do think that the psychologizing can sometimes benefit from a little bit more of ontologizing, if that makes sense. Yes.
Yeah, so Nietzsche analyzed the ring cycle with respect to this Aristotelian conception of tragedy and Greek mythological categories of Apollonian and Dionysian and so on. And I'm wondering to what extent Wagner was aiming to emulate anything classical or Mediterranean classical with his composition forms. Because of course, he's drawing from a completely different tradition for his material. So I'm wondering, if he was as steeped in the classical mythology as Nietzsche was, or not.
Well, okay. So the question is about the suggestion is that Nietzsche is going to classical forms and Aristotelian concepts of tragedy in order to explore what's the notion of tragedy. And you're asking if really Wagner was that so steeped in the classical tradition. Well, what was he aiming at? Well, I made a joke at the beginning. I feel desperately uncomfortable talking about intentionality because it's just not something that I particularly, yes, I can talk about intentions, but it's such a kind of like a hot topic. Again, I feel like it's another lecture, so I'm not going to go there with Wagner's intentions, and I'm not a Wagner scholar. But I will say, first of all, I would argue that Nietzsche is not using Aristotelian notions of tragedy. In fact, he's arguing for a new form of tragedy, which at that time, as you state, is a little bit on the verge of Schopenhauerian. But it's definitely a different form of tragedy to Aristotle. And his assertion that actually tragedy is quintessentially Aeschylus and a little bit of Sophocles definitely mitigates against an Aristotelian view. So we are not talking about catharsis here. We're talking about like getting a vision of the void and then somehow feeling like we're overcoming it. So it's about that new cycle and apotheosis rather than coming out having been relieved of all your emotions. So I wouldn't agree that there. So what about Wagner? Well, Wagner went to these lectures, so he definitely heard all of this. And as I said, it's not often I get to say things like that. And he was the person who actually encouraged Nietzsche to publish this book. And it was written at a very specific time. And clearly Nietzsche is riffing off Wagner. Is Wagner riffing off Nietzsche? I don't know. But certainly it is a very evocative story. Would Wagner have known the classic stories? Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, this is a moment in German culture that really goes through into the 20th century when the Greeks were everything. I mean, you only need to look from Nietzsche all the way through to Heidegger. The discussion of the genius of the Greeks. This is a moment, this relationship between the Greeks and the German spirit, or however they wanted to designate it, when it's actually kind of fascinating how they took the Greeks and how they utilized the Greeks and Greek stories and Greek ideas. Because if you think about it, many parts of our history have been connected to the revivification of the Romans, right? It's not necessarily the Greeks and the Athenians. So this idealization of the Greeks and of Greek culture is something really rather fascinating, which I have not explored, but I was really struck rereading Birth of Tragedy over these past few days to give this lecture, how much I would now like to go back to Heidegger and riff off that a little bit. I'm just going to make sure that sorry, no, it's okay. I'm happy to have the conversation. I just want to make sure of it, and then I'll come back to you. Yes?
Thank you. I was curious if you had any thoughts on the extent to which the way Wagner changes the original stories that compose the Ring of the Night and the Wilson's album, the extent to which those changes contribute to this integration of the Apollonian and the Dionysian, whether his introduction of the ring itself and the gods portion of the story, how that changes the balance that occurs.
So the question is about how Wagner utilizes the changes he makes. Are they related to this kind of notion of musical tragedy? You know what? I haven't thought about that. I'm now feeling like, could you do the whole ring cycle again next year? Because then I can come back to this. Because I think that is a fantastic question. I would love to explore it. I actually have given fragments of that lecture in years past, looking at the changes that Wagner did make to those stories and what they might have meant. But I've not put the two pieces together between, okay, there's this now, and these stories that they came from. What does that therefore mean for this particular interpretation, or any because I've only ever done it in terms of, okay, why did he take that story about the otter and the otter skin, and then put it into Das Rheingold, right? So I've thought about all of those things, but not put the two together. So I appreciate the thought, and I'm probably not going to do that right now. Thanks. Yes.
Well, I don't have a question. I just have a couple books to recommend if you haven't read them. For yours, it's a pretty amazing and long chapter about that, about how he obtained resources in The Ring of Truth by Roger Scruton. And then to you guys, there's a really fascinating book that I'm about to forward through called Wagner and Cosima, The Ring of Morcea by someone named Michael Hewlett. I really recommend it.
Did everybody get those quotations? So the first one is Roger Scruton, the philosopher, on Wagner, and
He really goes into depth about how Wagner related to the source.
no, what was the name of the book? So I can just Ring and The Ring of Truth, and then the other book was called Wagner and Aeschylus. And who was that by again?
Michael Ewan, E-W-A-N.
Michael Newman.
No,
Ewan.
Ewan.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. Yes.
I just wanted to point out that Nietzsche's view of the ancients is really revolutionary in its day. I mean, we remember Winckelmann, who thought of the ancient literature as calm dignity, and whereas Nietzsche points out when he calls the that it's really about the vortex of being, that it's about Dionysus and all its dark and irrationality. So Nietzsche really discovers or promotes a very different cauldron of Greek drama as opposed to this notion of calmness.
So the comment is about how Nietzsche's work and thinking on the Greek world was really revolutionary in the kind of the notion of the calmness or dignity of the Greeks as opposed to this Dionysiac spirit. That actually is really interesting because I haven't done it today. I keep saying that, by the way, but I only had an hour. But you know what would be really, really interesting to go a little bit further on, somewhere Nietzsche does not go, and if we go back to your point about the changes in the stories, is that if we think about what was lost, if we think about the Enlightenment's notion of the Greeks, because I was just reflecting on this when you were talking. My home territory is 15th and 16th century, so it's pre-Enlightenment. And the notion of the Greeks and the Greek revival then is not just a revival of calmness, for crying out loud, it's also a revival, for instance, of magic. And that is something we have not discussed here, that the Dionysiac and the magical elements of these pieces, and the kind of the supernatural forces here, right? So again, another lecture. Sorry, Hugh, they kind of keep crashing up. So anyway, yeah, I think that's really fascinating and something that if I maybe had a bit more time, I might have pushed my journey into Nietzsche and kept going out of the other side, if you see what I mean. And we could have gone into that story, but that would be another fascinating connection. Yeah. So, have we reached the natural moment?